Well, I'll declare this pre-submission seminar open. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Romitesh Kant. Now, I don't think he needs much introduction. So before we'll get on to that, I would like to mention that the supervision of Romitesh was a genuinely shared endeavour out of necessity. I knew nothing about gender theory, and so there was no comment really I could make on those chapters. Whereas in Karen and Sonia, we had some, and indeed Mercy, we had experts on gender politics and so on, and they could read those chapters with a fine-tooth comb. I could read the Fiji ones, the ones on the Fiji political parties, with the eye of someone who'd lived there and knew in my heart whether this was right. I could tell this was written by someone who knew Fiji very well. Now, just another thing I'd say is that in the past, most analyses of Fiji politics have discussed Fiji from the point of view of 4 cleavages, all of which begin with an R. Race, obviously. Religion, which is much the same as race, although there are quite a few Indian Christians. Rank, which is obvious. More obvious than you'd think, really, when you get to Fiji. And rights. The rights, for example, that are said to belong to those who are the descendants of the first occupiers of the land. And that has been one of the most important rights in the history of Fiji, which comes up against the rights of settlers. Now, Romitesh brings another far more, in some ways, fundamental cleavage, another lens, which reveals much more, called gender. And he does so at Romitesh. If I need to, I'll just say that he's a product of USP. He's already an academic with a CV in publications. So he came to this PhD in a pretty well-prepared way. And it has been, I have to say, quite a pleasure to be working with him. I'll hand over to Romitesh.
Sorry, we're just dealing with some technical issues, but I guess I'll start. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live and work, the Nenwal and Nambu people. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and will be original land. Thank you, Professor Bula, everyone. Welcome to this seminar. It's been a long 3.5-year journey. Interesting and motivating in ways, but also very challenging. So this research for me is more than academic. It emerges from long hours of observing politics, not only in parliamentary chambers or political party offices or AGMs of political parties, but also in very quieter, less formal spaces where power actually moves in very subtle ways, more subtle than the formal spaces. These were I drank a lot of kava, so a lot of kava sessions, both political and non-political, in community events as well, and in corridors between workshops and meetings. So what began as a very structured inquiry in my head on why masculinities remain so central to political life in Fiji and elsewhere as well, despite the numerous democratic reforms that Fiji has gone through, inclusionary rhetoric that constantly gets employed, and it quickly delved and became a deeper mediation on how power is embedded. So questions around how power is embodied, how it is performed, and sustained in ways we rarely name them, yet we constantly feel its presence. From the outset, I knew that understanding political masculinity would require more than just doing interviews or document analysis. These would not be satisfactory in uncovering these subtle ways in which power actually manifests itself and gets embodied and gets practiced, performed, and contested. So it demanded a presence. Presence in different ways, and I'll elaborate on it in a bit. So I came, these are the formal spaces, some pictures of formal spaces that I attended. And these are some comments that people made to me during these formal spaces. So patriarchy, observations by politicians, party members, by activists who were in these political spaces talked about patriarchy a lot. So I was attending the Sodalpa Party AGM. One very prominent woman, Mary Semisoni, basically I went and introduced myself and she was like, oh, you'll see patriarchy at play in this, very loudly. And I didn't want people to know that I was there in a way to just observe. I was at the National Federation Party convention celebrating its 60th anniversary of its founding. And they were handing out plaques to prominent people across the decades, across 6 decades. And the plaques were all going to men. So Shamim Ali is sitting right in front of me, well-known Fijian feminist. She just turns around and she's like, this is how history gets written by men, about men. So these were ways in which people commented to me in these observations as well, in immersion. Sorry. So what I came to this research simply not as a scholar, but as someone whose body, history, and politics are already entangled in the terrain that I chose to study, my home country, Fiji. I occupy a very interesting space within Fiji as well, not indigenous, descendants of indentured laborers, part of the story, but not really central to it. So these are positionalities that I had to grapple with. As an Indo-Fijian man who's born in Suva, lived in Suva all my life until my PhD, this has been the longest time I've been away from Fiji. I carried into the field not only just a set of questions that I wanted to ask and answered, but I carried a layered presence in Fiji as well. And I was never just observing. I was present with skin in the game, someone who knew the stakes of the political rupture that I was observing, its institutional exclusions that this rupture embodied, but also someone as a man who benefits from this, from the patriarchal logics that underpin our politics. And I was critiquing it as well. So this was a double bind for me as well. Being reflexive and aware that I was both implicated in and resistant to the structures I was studying. And it shaped every aspect of the research that I was doing. So my identity afforded me certain proximities. It granted me access to closed meetings. I got access, I got invites, informal invites. I was privy to insider conversations at times. I was often seen as very familiar in some spaces, especially in progressive and activist circles. My academic credentials in Fiji sometimes granted me a veneer of neutrality, but proximity did not guarantee belonging in these spaces as well. When I started this research, thinking about this research, I assumed, and a lot of my assumptions were questioned. I assumed, given Fiji's very racialized political, ethno-political, social political space, that in indigenous Fijian spaces, I would be othered. And that was my own biases that informed this research. What I found in the field was completely different. These spaces, indigenous Fijian spaces, political spaces, but also cultural spaces, extended a form of conditional inclusion to me, especially when I performed with respect, humility, and political engagement. In fact, many indigenous Fijian political and social gatherings, particularly in villages, in communities, were very open. And these were mediated by my colleagues, my indigenous Fijian colleagues. And they helped me navigate these spaces. And I got to see how authority moves in indigenous Fijian spaces, both political, formal political, and informal. It was in the Indo-Fijian spaces that I unexpectedly encountered resistance. I thought being Indo-Fijian would grant me access to these Indo-Fijian spaces, which are male-dominated. And it would translate into access. But I encountered gatekeeping, especially from older male leaders. But these spaces also illuminated my own positioning within the Indo-Fijian male hierarchy. It got me to think deeply about where I fit in the Indo-Fijian socio-political settings as well. Got me to question my own masculine position within this, especially given that my background has been shaped by my activism in Fiji, by my scholarship, and also my feminist engagements. It didn't always align with Indo-Fijian dominant ideals about Indo-Fijian malehood, manhood, but also political manhood, and which usually tends to prize, decorum, hierarchy, crossing the boundaries from boyhood to manhood, but also some semblance of professional detachment in a political space that is hyper-racialized. So I was both too close and not quite right in these spaces as well. And I felt this quite interestingly in Indo-Fijian spaces. So this misalignment actually highlights that insider-outsider binaries are rarely stable, as literature attests to. Belonging is contingent, negotiated both through language, through how we present ourselves, through deference, and through timing as well. It was not simply about who I was, but how I was read by actors in different spaces and at different times. And this is why ethics for me became one of the crucial aspects of my research. It wasn't just a procedural checkpoint, something that you tick the boxes for ethics applications. It had to be embodied in different ways. I grounded this in 4 sort of interdependent principles, and these are informed by feminist methodologies, specific feminist methodologies, by Pacific methodologies, and decolonial praxis. These commitments shaped how I moved, when I chose to speak, when I chose to withdraw, what spaces I entered, and what I was privy to, information that I was privy to, stories that I was privy to. In many ways, this research is much a study of political masculinities, as it is a reflection of what it means to carry one's body in these political spaces, one's politics and ethics into the heart of the very institutions that we're trying to understand and perhaps change. So apart from the formal, I got drawn into activism very quickly. During this period, I found myself drawn to activist protests, not as just an observer, but also someone who came from that background. So these are some pictures of the Fukushima March, anti-Fukushima Dump March, the Reclaim the Night marches. There are many others. And nowhere this was more personally consuming than in the wake of the genocide that started in Gaza. Like many across the world, I couldn't remain just distant. And I had to pause my research for a little while and get into these spaces because our politicians are Christian Zionists, and they tend to support Israel no matter what, and lives are measured through that lens. So I was not simply documenting, during this research process as well. I was collectively organizing, grieving, and demanding better of our leaders. Yet, even in these activist circles, I was still the researcher, taking mental field notes whenever I could on how masculinity, hierarchy, and voice played out in these informal civil society spaces. So when I say my research moved across the formal and the informal terrains, I meant it moved literally. It embodied, I observed both parliament and protest, both the echoes in the chamber, in the party AGMs, but also in the chants that were in the streets, asking for ending of violence against women, or for our government to fulfill its anti-nuclear commitments that it had made, or just basic recognition of dignity of other people that we are connected to. So activism helped me stay grounded. It reminded me that politics is not only about elite negotiations or party manifestos. It was also about collective grief, but imagining justice across borders and refusing silence when it matters most. So this led me to develop a practice earlier on in the thesis of what I call the hanging heuristic. So I developed this in a way to distinguish what I did in the field. So hanging out in the initial days was just hanging around in cafes where I knew political party leaders, politicians would frequent, so I could approach them and informally talk to them, build trust and rapport with people. Just walking up to political party offices and trying to see if they allow me to hang out there. Hanging around meant constant repeated visits to these places, the cafes, political party offices, asking to join cover sessions that they hold on Friday afternoons, sometimes hanging around different workshops, civil society offices as well, and observe how rituals and hierarchies were maintained and contested, and interviews intersped around these as well. Hanging in was more deliberate. It was to seek access to annual general meetings, to certain meetings that were closed to outsiders who were not party members. So I did get access to some, not all. And hanging back was withdrawal. And these were calculated withdrawals when things got too much, when persistence was not paying off, when frustration took over. It just required me to hang back a little bit, detach, and reflect on what's happening in a way that I could think about my positionality, why things were happening and not happening. Refine some journals about certain events that I attended. Think through these things. So takes me to the research puzzle. Most of it was covered in the MTR, so I'll speed through this. But these ethnographic and ethical commitments allowed me to address my central puzzle, that why, despite decades of political upheaval, coups in Fiji, democratic reforms that Fiji has undertaken in its 55-year history, and the inclusionary rhetoric, why, despite these, do masculine norms and gender hierarchies remain deeply embedded in these institutions? To guide this inquiry, my thesis is driven by this overarching question: how are political masculinities constructed, performed, legitimized, and contested within Fiji's political parties? And then there are 3 subsidiary questions. Initially, when I conceptualized this, I was looking at the parliament and the political parties and the transition in itself. But then in the writing phase, one has to. So the context is interesting here because initially my research was designed to observe the 2022 elections in Fiji. And, the whole contest was between two military commanders, coup leaders, in their own right, strongmen, So that was the main contest. So I was thinking, going in, observing the election process, talking to people. However, that became untenable because the government at the time changed electoral laws that did not allow research, especially if it was affiliated to foreign institutions and foreign funding, which my scholarship at ANU and my affiliation with DPA, made me a foreign agent of sorts. So I had to come back from Fiji, and then go back to the drawing board and ask the question about, how do I do this? How do I observe masculinities and gender in the absence of elections? Which was very depressing. But I think the research is better for it, because after 16 years, Bainimarama was dislodged from power. There was a political reform that was promised with the new coalition government. This coalition government in itself was ideologically different from each other, 3 different parties coming together, sometimes with the similar ideologies, but sometimes with differing ideologies. Their main goal that united them was to dislodge Bainimarama, and they had achieved that. And it was a new dawn. But within this political reform, Fiji's transition from authoritarian rule into a semblance of democratic rule actually showed that the language of change and new dawns that I was observing was less of a rupture and more of a recalibration of authority, where familiar masculinities were repackaged for a new political moment in Fiji's history. So my initial title of my thesis was Unraveling Political Masculinities, which now has changed, because masculinities, I realized talking to my supervisors, has not been unraveled. It's just been repackaged and recalibrated and reformed and presented in a new way. So this volatile shifting terrain shaped contours of my fieldwork, sharpening my focus on how political masculinities adapt, endure, and reset themselves in moments of apparent transformation. And feminists actually talked about a patriarchal backlash, that while they were instrumental, they held the ground in all the 3 successive coups for democracy, for human rights, that after this reform, especially after 2006, the feminist movement in Fiji held the ground strong, while others faltered because ideologically they felt that Bainimarama was bringing in something that they've always wanted. These were the progressives. There was a feeling within the women's movement and the feminist movement that there was a patriarchal backlash with this transition as well. And initially, when the euphoria subsided, these became more and more apparent, that masculinity was being repackaged and men were being given positions of power and authority that they felt they were denied for 16 years. So the core argument that I'm trying to make here is that masculinities in Fiji does not operate merely as individual traits, but as a resilient and interlocking system of masculinities as political infrastructure, masculinities as political grammar, and masculinities as adaptive legitimacy. This tripartite framework, which I hope elucidates and tries to collectively organize and shine a light on how masculine political power is naturalized, shaping not only who leads, but how leadership is imagined in Fiji, and how it is performed, sustained, and contested in salient ways. So this is my thesis structure. Obviously there's introduction. This is a sort of a historical retelling of Fiji's political history with a gendered lens. And where's Annie's research on Friday. Oh, there. Annie's research on Friday, actually, her archival work resonated with me quite a lot, because while I did not do archival research, it actually shows that there is more that is needed to be done on unpacking how the modern state in the Pacific has been reconceptualized and reconstructed, both through colonization, Christianization, and these forces are deeply gendered, and how they have reshaped traditional systems in ways that still persist and manifest itself. Chapter 3 and 4 is on sort of conceptual framework and methodology. and research design. And then my chapters 5 to 8 are individual case studies of the 4 political parties in power in parliament. So the first one looks at Bainimarama and Fiji First. Fiji First was formed in 2014 as Fiji was transitioning into parliamentary democracy or parliamentary rule, transitioning from authoritarian to parliamentary rule. Still don't want to call it democracy because it wasn't, because it was repackaged. So it looks at Bainimarama's Fiji First party. The second chapter, chapter 6, looks at the Social Democratic Liberal Party, which was an indigenous Fijian party that was dislodged in 2006 coup, the Songo Dua Bata di Leono Vanua Party, and renamed because Bainimarama's laws actually said names of political parties should not be in vernacular. It should be in English. So they renamed it to Sodelpa, and they became an opposition to Bainimarama's civic nationalist reforms in a way, and challenging the erasure of indigenous Fijian rights, indigenous Fijian customary institutions, religious institutions, to Bainimarama's secularist, national identity, social reengineering. Then I look at chapter 7. I still have to figure out whether it comes as chapter 7 or 8, but People's Alliance Party. People's Alliance Party is a breakaway party from Sodelpa, but it also repositions itself. So whilst having claims to protect indigenous Fijian rights in the political domain, it also projects a sense of multiculturalism, sort of moderate ethno-nationalism, where there's more accommodation of different groups, but it's very chaotic because it's formed in 2021 by Rambuka. Then the last party I look at is the National Federation Party. It's a party formed in the 1960s. It's Fiji and the Pacific's oldest functioning political party. It's formed in the cane fields, representing Indo-Fijian interests initially, but then morphed into a national party as Fiji was decolonizing and heading towards independence. But it has remained largely an Indo-Fijian-based party. And then my chapter 9 is a discussion/conclusion chapter that tries to weave the conceptual framework and these empirical chapters into a story that these parties talk to each other all the time, and they contest each other, but also align with each other. So I'll present this seminar in 3 parts. I've looked at the conceptual foundations. I'll go into the empirical analysis and then sort of synthesis and conclusion. So in terms of my theoretical and conceptual framing, political masculinities is my core analytical focus, how masculinities operate in the political domain. And there's an emerging literature around it, not clearly defined like all terms in political science. And I rely on feminist institutionalism, looking at the formal and the informal, formal rules and the informal practices, and how that operates. It has been used for feminist analysis, looking at women's political representation, but I'm using it to look at male power and privilege. I use intersectionality to look at how different groups. So these are not just adding these groups, these are how these different groups of age, gender, sexuality, class intersect within this idea of how power is operationalized, how power is performed and contested. And then I look at the question, theoretical sort of lens of state nationalism. In Fiji, the state, the modern nation state, is a contested terrain. There are contestations on what form the state should take. And as I focus in my chapter 2, my introductory Fiji chapter, the state, these contestations of the state, ideological contestations, actually are deeply gendered. And I then develop a conceptual lens, which looks at masculinities as infrastructure, as grammar and adaptive legitimacy, and how they inform how power operates in masculine ways. So quickly shift through this. I've done 257 interviews, 1-year fieldwork. 119 of them were formal interviews where I approached people, and the rest were through ethnographic immersion, where I bumped into people, they had something interesting to say, and I sat down with them for sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 25 minutes, and just talked to them about particular things that were happening, even in a meeting or workshop. A lot of them are talking to taxi drivers. If you've gone to Fiji, taxi drivers are a repository of so much knowledge and political insights. You get so much political insights from these taxi drivers, and they love to talk. So a lot of the taxi drivers, in the transiting between home and these meetings and coming back, that ask, what are you doing? And then they'd be very free to share a lot of information. So in terms of my empirical finding, I try to conceptualize this in chapter 9. And thanks to Professor Margaret Joly, who's always since year 1 emphasized, do not get into the trap of hegemonic masculinities formulations because they're hegemonic in a way. And I agree that it does not capture what's happening in Fiji in politics. So I look at try to conceptualize it as dominant and dominating masculinities. What does it mean in different political parties? So these are indigenous Fijian masculinities. Dominant are chiefly relying on Vanua legitimacy, lineage, authority, ancestral authority, but also underpinned by Christian masculinities as well, Christianity, moral service, religious discipline. These are dominant. They remain dominant across these political ruptures we've had. So whilst when Fiji became independent, they were dominant and dominating in the sense that we had 4 big chiefs leading Fiji, and there was semblance of independence has been handed over to the chiefly system and to chiefs. It has been ruptured. The dominating masculinities, what we see are these militarized as a result of our coups. These are masculinities that Rambuka embodied in 1987, that Bainimarama has embodied since 2000 actually. Command, they embody a sense of command, expect silence, impose a different type of hierarchy, but they gain their legitimacy through the chiefly systems at times. So Bainimarama or Rambuka gained legitimacy as militarized masculinity through the chiefly system, but also through religious moral appeals as well, that his coup was a divine coup ordained by God and supported by chiefs. Whereas Bainimarama actually shoved them aside, and he created the military, what Chonebala Indrakondroka says, a 4th confederacy, a power on its own, an institution which wields power on its own. Whilst under the chiefly system, it was seen, the military was seen as supporting the triad of political power. I conceptualize Indo-Fijian masculinities as being complicit. They reproduce patriarchal power, and they work with dominant and dominating masculinities to reproduce male dominance in Fiji's political. But then within indigenous Fijian, there are technocrats. These are civil servants. These are people who've actually done well in the private sector, who actually provide, and thank you to Opeta if he's there. He helped me conceptualize this quite a lot. A lot of knocks in his office just to say, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? Tell me. So he actually helped me understand the technocratic side of it, because these indigenous Fijian technocrats who are educated, who do well in civil service and private sector, actually provide support to both dominant and dominating, but also challenge the dominant and dominating in ways that are more subtle as well, but also very overt. And then obviously the youth and what I call subaltern, these are Indo-Fijian cane farmers. These are indigenous Fijian who live in villages, who are not technocratic, who are not chiefly, who are not militaristic. They occupy a very subaltern. These are the places where power is derived from. And during 2000 coup, your work has been instrumental as well in highlighting some of these ways in which dominant dominating masculinities actually employ the subaltern and mobilize them for political gain. And then queer masculinities, obviously queer people are at the margins. They are in political parties in the political system, but they're at the margins of it. So I'll go through this is just a snapshot. I think it's an injustice that we've been asked to condense everything in such a small time. But this is just a snapshot of some findings from the empirical chapters. So I'll go through masculinities as political infrastructure, and this determines the architecture of power. Basically, what I mean by this is how the informal and the formal rules and norms hierarchies and networks have embedded itself with masculine authority in the very design of the institutions itself. And how this embeddedness has then been operationalized to produce and reproduce male dominance and male power. So this architecture, infrastructure actually shapes who holds power, but also how power is exercised, both structurally, both visibly and invisibly. So Fiji First was all about command and control, because the military regime transitioned itself or transformed itself into a political party, a so-called political party. It called itself a movement, but the movement was based on these two men, Bainimarama as the enforcer, Ayas Keyum as the brains behind this whole thing. Sorry, the planner, as I call it in my thesis. So it was masculinity as control. It was authoritarian, political party disguised as authoritarian, disguised as a political party, disguised as an authoritarian, reimagined. And they were the infrastructure in the party. I did not get access to observing any of this because the party has never held any AGMs or public forums. But these two were the infrastructure. Without them, 1 year after my fieldwork and I came back to Canberra, the party disintegrated because these two had left the party. And it disintegrated in a very, like the rules that were designed by Ayaz and Bainimarama to ensure them political power for life were the same rules that they became prey to. And, it led to a very spectacular, for those of us who've waited 16 years, it led to a very spectacular disintegration of this political party, to the point where the party is now no more, deregistered. So when we look at SODELPA, the Social Democratic Liberal Party, in contrast to PG First, it anchors its authority in the cultural and spiritual jurisdiction of the Vanua, with chiefly lineage, and sort of on Christian moral authority as well. And the military is there. There are some people in SODELPA who are former military officers. But as I mentioned earlier, Bainimarama had shifted the military away as an institution, but these militaristic masculinities were still very present. And it shows the contestation that happened in SODELPA since 2014, when Rote Mumukepa, one of the highest ranking chiefs, was leading the party, became the leader of opposition, but very quickly she got replaced by Rambuka, because to challenge Bainimarama, the only viable option is to bring a strong military man within your ranks. So a lot of these opposition political parties actually had to restructure themselves to respond to Bainimarama and Fiji First dominance. When we talk about masculinities as political grammar, I look at the symbolic and affective scripts, the unwritten rules. So all of their political party constitutions actually talk about women inclusion, youth inclusion, and they're very progressive if you read it as the constitution itself. But then there are all these unwritten rules that shape how leadership is legitimated, legitimized, and exercised and performed. So I thought NFP would be the best one here, because they employ these masculinities of moderation. I'll just use a small vignette. At the 60th anniversary of their party convention in Raki in 2023, the party leader, Biman Prasad, was giving a speech in English. Then he code switched to standard Hindi, which is problematic on its own, because for us, Fiji Baat is our lingua franca, not the Hindi from India. But Biman is of the view that standard Hindi is our identity. So he code switched. And it was interesting what he said to the people gathered, because these were mainly Indo-Fijians. He basically reminded the Indo-Fijians that gone are the days when Indo-Fijians can aspire to high political office and contest for high political office. Reminded them of the declining population. from almost 51% in the 1980s to about 30% now. That the political power of the Indo-Fijian community as a whole is declining. So there's a need to walk across boundaries, ethnic boundaries, and to form alliances with indigenous Fijian parties. And he was speaking to Indo-Fijians in the crowd. And he was also at the same time justifying his alliance with Rambuka's People's Alliance Party as well. NFP is a multicultural party, has always proclaimed sort of civic nationalist ideals about equality, egalitarianism, very gendered. They've had chiefs in their ranks and prominent indigenous Fijians in their ranks, but it still is very Indo-Fijian in its operation. So that was a very telling moment on the grammar of itself. The words he used to Indo-Fijians saying, gone are those days. The 80s, 70s, and 80s are gone. We have to work with indigenous Fijian parties, dominant indigenous Fijian leaders, form alliances, and make sure that the community's interests are ahead. Otherwise, it's political marginalization again. Indo-Fijian masculinities also operate in my thesis. I talk about it. Assertive Indo-Fijian masculinity is frowned upon because it's seen as a disrespect to indigenous Fijian traditional authority. So if you think about, Mahendrapal Chaudhry, the Indo-Fijian leader who was deposed in 1999, he was very assertive. He'd stand up and he'll just say things, sometimes true, but he'll just be blunt. And that's seen as a disrespect by indigenous Fijian political leaders. So Indo-Fijian leaders have to then moderate and this has shaped Fiji's political history as well. In the lead up to independence, Indo-Fijian leaders were demanding equal rights and very vehemently demanding it. But there was compromises that were made in the 1970 constitution. In the 1997 constitution, that's the same thing. Indo-Fijian leaders actually came to the table and started moderating their political demands. So moderation and assertiveness is a form of Indo-Fijian masculinities. So Biman here, Biman Prasad, the Deputy Prime Minister, is often actually laughed at as being weak because he's not assertive. So in the Indo-Fijian voter mindset, you need to be assertive, but he's not because he's doing the moderation. So there is that contestation that happens within Indo-Fijian masculinities as well. PEP's adaptive inclusion. So the People's Alliance Party, this is Rambuka's party. So it's born out of the Social Democratic Liberal Party, breakaway. 14 of the 21 sitting MPs actually left the Sodelpa party and formed this. The infrastructure is very much mirroring Sodelpa in the Vanua, chiefly authority at the top. Rambuka is the leader. They also have they proclaimed a lot of inclusion, multicultural inclusion. A lot of the background people in PEP were also Indo-Fijian businessmen. One of them is our High Commissioner to Australia. They were the financiers of the party as well. So there are different types and ways in which Indo-Fijians have been, and it was very inclusive to women as well. A lot of the women we talked to in a separate project with Dr. Karen, these women were educated women in civil service, in consultancy work, in international organizations who joined PEP because of its inclusionary rhetoric and framework. Masculinity is as adaptive legitimacy. So what I say is generally that the contested ideologies of the nation state in Fiji and the contestation between civic nationalism and ethno-nationalism and the contested multiculturalism that is always the solution, and Fiji is going through that contested multiculturalism now. It creates legitimacy and masculinity that adapts through these contestations. So you have extreme ethno-nationalists who demand Fiji as a Christian state, sovereignty being returned to indigenous Fijians, all that stuff. You see indigenous Fijian leaders moderating their own ranks and coming to the middle to reach out. You see assertive Indo-Fijians who want one person, one vote, national identity, but then they moderate their political claims and come to the middle. And it's actually very gendered in a way because it allows leaders to adapt their masculinities and reproduces sort of male dominance. I think Tale Mangioni's article on Amelia Rokotivuna that came out recently actually shows a progressive indigenous Fijian feminist who actually stood up against the 87 coup and being classed as un-Fijian. And this is how these work as policing mechanisms for people who actually do not agree with these ideologies within both communities. So it's a very interesting paper to read because she was head of the YWCA, very prominent indigenous Fijian woman. Not much is read about or known about her, but Tale, in uncovering some of these, actually looks at how women get policed by these ideologies in itself, because these ideologies are very dominantly male. It's my Rambuka. It's a transition from a strong man. I don't know, I think it was Michael who had a book, and I thought it was Rambuka in your office. Apparently it's Jerry Singarock from walked into his office. I'm like, hey, that's Rambuka. He's like, no, it's a. So from a military strongman, he's apologized multiple times for his coups in the 1987. He's been a very interesting character in Fiji's politics. He's had his finger in all the coups. He's played the game well and he's adapted. But in the lead up to the 2022 elections, he was constantly apologizing for his coups, apologizing to Indo-Fijians. When he won, he was apologizing to everyone, which started annoying a lot of us because we're like, just govern, do the reforms. Instead of apologizing, he went to Kiribati, apologized on behalf of the Pacific Islands Forum. So there's a lot of redemption for him. Don't get me started on the Ocean of Peace. But this is People's Alliance Party's redemptive masculinity at play here. And it's adaptive because Rambuka has seen a space. When I was in the field, a lot of people were telling me that he'll serve 2 years and then he'll hand over party power to his younger indigenous Fijian male colleagues. Came to Canberra in 2024, he basically said, I want to run again. It's 76. So there is a lot of questioning of his own sort of position within the party as well, because where is the transition? Otherwise, it becomes a party like Bainimarama. This is from the PEP. So while it proclaims moderation and adaptation, the AGM was inherently very indigenous, very Christian. There was a prayer. It was all men on the podium, all men sitting right in front. There are buses coming in from the villages, but they were sitting right on top at the gymnasium. So it just shows that while the rhetoric of adaptation and moderation is there, in practice, it's very much leader-centric. I also want to talk a little bit about state rituals and reconciliation. So the first Girmit Day or Indenture Day was celebrated in Fiji after 100 and whatever years as a public holiday, 1 week celebrations. And there was a public forgiveness ceremony organized by the Methodist Church for its role in the 87 and 2000 coups in supporting it. What became was basically, it became an apology between men. Narratives of women in this apology were missing. So this is Chaudhry and Rambuka apologizing, Rambuka apologizing to Chaudhry. They're hugging it out. So redemption again get recast within this contested multiculturalism that Fiji has gone through again. The Great Council of Chiefs got reinstituted after it was disestablished officially in 2012. It got reestablished, and there were a lot of conversations in Fiji in the fieldwork time during my time in the field as well. Was inclusion of women. Is there a need to include women in the Great Council of Chiefs? It's a very male-dominated institution in itself because it's dealing with traditionally installed chiefs, and this is again any staff. Again, it's dealing with sort of culture and custom, and sort of gender inclusion questions around that and how it gets repurposed. So the chiefs have come back to the fold in sort of an official sense. It was always there, but institutionally and officially it's there now, and Rambuka gains a lot of legitimacy from this. So Rotemo Mukepa was one of the very few women who were in the initial, when I was doing this fieldwork, who was out there trying to get more and more women to do submissions, make submissions to the commission, the committee that was looking at the reform. I'm not going to speak too much about this, but it just shows return of sort of chiefly authority in the official formal political space, and adaptations around contested multiculturalism. So on one hand, the Grimit Day was being celebrated, this institution was being reinstituted, Ratu Sukuna Day was being celebrated. So in Bainimarama's time, these were all absent. So multiculturalism is coming back, but in a very different way. I've talked a little bit about this, but Fiji Fest collapsed practically. The group, 26 MPs, shifted to group of 9 and group of 16. The group of 9 have now joined Rambuka's coalition. And these were all mostly former military officers, police officers, who broke away ranks with the Fiji Fest group. So what about the women in this? So while my primary focus is on masculinities and men, it's impossible to actually ignore how these systems shape and constrain women's participation. So inclusion for women was carefully managed, visible, yes, but on terms that were set by these masculine infrastructures of power. Across the parties, I've actually noticed this contained inclusion, this managed inclusion. Women were present, but rarely in ways that threatened this existing power structures. And there's Indo-Fijian women would tell me that within the National Federation Party, which is an Indo-Fijian dominated party, there's a lot of gender policing that happens for Indo-Fijian women. While indigenous Fijian women find it easier to navigate the National Federation Party because custom and tradition is not present. Indigenous Fijian women in the traditional parties have to navigate custom and tradition because they mirror custom and tradition. So there are silent ways in which women actually employ this power. So I got to observe the Andi Dakambau School Old Girls Network at play. So they talked about that they are the power brokers behind, and they maneuver in ways that are culturally appropriate for them. A lot of these kava sessions that I attended were actually male dominated. The youth ones were more in the political party setting. The youth ones were more gender sort of open. And one of the clearest examples of gender policing was the case of Linda Tambuya. And so the little background, a private video of her got leaked online. And she was removed as the deputy party leader of the People's Alliance Party, and also as the Minister for Women. All the conversations informally were about the contents of the video, as opposed to a gross violation of her privacy. Even within the political party itself, it was about the content of the video and how Linda Tambuya brought disrepute. But on the flip side, there's an alleged affair as well. The guy is a minister and from the other party actually gets promoted to the political party leadership. He becomes the political party leader of Sodelpa. So the repercussions of women and how they have to constantly perform. Linda has been at the forefront of this because she's an indigenous Fijian woman. When she wears a modern dress, the newspapers will post a photo about her. Look, she's wearing a modern dress. Or look, she's straightened her hair. How anti-indigenous Fijian she is. And always gets questioned. So there's that double bind that women face within these spaces as well, of how much they can just be themselves authentically within this. Queer individuals are present in political parties. That's Fiji's first trans woman who contested the elections under the National Federation Party. But there's pronounced erasure. It was interesting for me to talk to queer individuals in the ethno-nationalist sort of Sodelpa party, because I was like, help me explain, why are you in this party that, does not believe that, you should exist or your identity exists? And they talked about the multi-layered sort of identities they embody, that under Bainimarama 16-year rule, it was their indigenous identity that was under threat. And they can wear different hats in different spaces. So they navigate these political party spaces in ways they know how to navigate it, through culture and custom as well. So they know when to be sitting in the grok session with the men, when to be with the women. These were the trans political party representatives. Within NFP, it's interesting as well. They are present, mostly indigenous Fijian queer people are present, but they manage their inclusion in a way that they are there in the background mostly. They never put up front. visibility is very conditional, and there are limits to the inclusion as well within this space. So before I end, I need to say thanks to a few people. So I think I'd like to extend to my panel gratitude and thanks who have carried me through this journey. You've brought different, as Professor Stewart mentioned, different lens to the table. You've accommodated and tolerated my interrupting you in your offices. You've read my long chapters, very long repetitive chapters. You've helped me see structure where I couldn't see structure. You've offered me very patient provocations in this space as well, the last 3.5 years. We've disagreed, we've agreed, but you held the space for ideas for me to develop on my own and nurture that. And I'd also like to thank the Fijian feminists. Many of them are friends, mentors, co-conspirators who walked alongside me in this process. Before the PhD, we were friends and co-conspirators. So this research was never an academic exercise for me. It grew out of the conversations with these women, seeing how their works gets legitimized and also delegitimized because they simply call themselves feminists, unapologetically feminists. We've marched together. They've held me accountable numerous times. And they've helped me see how silences, in rituals, in everyday gestures, that I need to see gender at play. They've taught me how to listen, sometimes how to sit with discomfort that I used to face. I used to always rely on them during the fieldwork as well when I faced discomfort. They helped me understand how to ask questions that do not flatten but deepen my own understanding. And they've helped me be braver and sharpen my politics and more attuned to what solidarity actually means. And some of you, I know Melanie and them are online, some of you will recognize your fingerprints in this work, in the questions I've asked, in the ethics I've tried to embody, and I tried to hold. In the moments I step back, you may not appear in the footnotes, but I think you are everywhere in this architecture of this research. So thank you very much for the fire, the laughter, and the hard conversations we've had in the field and outside. And I hope this works honors your labor, the resistance, and the vision that they want, a more gender equal Fiji. Thank you very much.
Well, we've got more than enough material there for questions and comments. And we have a number of people in this room who know Fiji backwards. So it's open to comments and questions.
Thank you. I was absolutely thrilled. I think this is such important work. And I'm already not only looking forward to the thesis, but to the book, which will be such a valuable contribution to Fijian studies that we are, I think, all waiting for. And what struck me was the, as we say in Cambodia sometimes, same thing but different.
Oh,
and because yeah, so much has returned, but in different shapes. My PhD was like 25 years ago, during the Fiji, doing the state coup, and but so much has returned, and the discourse is. So my question and the kind of contestations, the players, so Rambuka, it's like eerie, you think like we're in a time warp, but then again you're not, because as you show so nicely, certain things have really shifted. My question would be a little bit, so the players, so you showed us very nicely how all these male players have re-emerged in different forms and parties, and these players in the 90s had a very close alliance. If I look at Rambuka with the feminists at that time, in the preamble of the 1997 Constitution, for example, and the reconciliation phase at that time, Shamima Ali showed her There was Iran, Hongyi, I mean, Fiji Women's Rights Movement, Fiji Women's Crisis Center. And I'm wondering, in these spaces that are masculine, that are formed now in these masculine spaces, if these alliances in this very intimate political space of Fiji, but we talk about numbers and who's who, and the city of Suva, where everyone knows everyone, and how if these old connections do work again, maybe behind the scenes in feminist, and to bring feminist concerns into these new masculine spaces.
Thank you. Someone was asking who's speaking, so if you'd like to.
Oh, sorry, my name is Tina. I am an ANU alumni. I did my PhD with Margaret 25 years ago or 20 years ago, and I'm just returning as a fellow. And I worked in Fiji, and I have been a student at the University of the South Pacific.
I think Imran is saying hi to you.
Yeah. No, I just mentioned you, as you can see. So yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
No, I think
it was on gender, ethnicity, nation in the context of the state coup. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a very important point about how it reemerges, because when I see the National Federation Party, it actually talks a lot about its relationship with Rambuka in the 1990s as well. And I remember having a chat with Imrana, and she was talking about the Family Law Act around that time, and the feminists who were actually lobbying the government for non-discrimination laws in the Constitution, which were quite progressive for its own time. And they talked about how they've worked with the AG and tried to work. And I think these women's organizations and feminists in Fiji actually work these informal relationships, because whilst in the 2006 coup in the aftermath, a lot of the civil society was cast aside, it was also like people like Shamim Ali, who could talk to Ayaz Qayyum directly, because there were all these relationships from 87, and it morphs and remorphs itself over time. And I think with the absence like Rambuka gone, it's going to be a different infrastructure, because his leadership actually holds the party together. So it's in Fiji, that's the main thing, as you would know, it's the cult of personality of a leader. And it's quite strong in very different ways. And once the leader goes, then there's a sort of a rush to reclaim that, and different characters, usually men, reappear to reclaim those spaces. But there's all these relationships that actually go back a long, long time. I was just talking to someone about the Supreme Court case and Nikonawai Kula, once the reinstatement of 1997 Constitution, but he was the same one who was very active in the 2000 coup, saying 1997 Constitution is an affront to indigenous Fijian rights. So they sort of reform themselves in ways that give them legitimacy. And hope I've answered your question.
Oh,
Yes, Imrana, you can speak.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So I just found your presentation so good. I knew it was going to be good because you would be tackling things that hadn't been tackled before in Fiji. So I'm so greatly looking forward to reading the final PhD. Just a few observations. And maybe everybody who is online from Fiji knows this, others may not. One of the problems, if you will, of living in a small country, and it is a small country, I live currently in Manila, so you can imagine how small Fiji is compared to that, is that it's really hard to hold on to your principles. In a big country where you have your own little circles of people, you can be a principled person and stick to those principles. Fiji is not like that, because when you stick to your principles or your ethics, you lose multiple friendships and connections. You can even be isolated. So people are more willing to give up their principles for the sake of connection and community. And this is even more evident in the indigenous Fijian community. And I see it all the time. I see it in my husband's village, and I see it in his community and in the larger political circles. So that's one point I wanted to make, because I think that explains a lot. I remember being so condemning of people who cross the floor for example, and switched alliances. And even now, I still feel that about so many of the Fiji First Party who suddenly saw the light and switched to PAP, because it's about two things. It's about connections and it's about wanting to be part of something. And the cynical part of me is it's about money as well. Okay, so that's one important lesson I've learned over the years trying to understand Fijian politics. The second thing which I thought was so insightful, Romitesh, was the point you made about how Indigenous Fijian women are better able to navigate the NFP than Indian ethnic Indian women. And I think that's so true. And I've now seen it in operation. I wonder, though, whether the same could be said of Indian women who are members of SADELPA and PAP. But of course, there aren't, are there? And I stand to be corrected as to whether I'm right or wrong. I'm in and out of Fiji. I don't follow everything all the time. And I'm wondering whether the same, with it. I mean, for example, if somebody like me, an Indian outspoken woman, joined any of the Fijian parties, would I be given the same respect and the same navigatability as the two Indigenous Fijian women have been given in the NFP? To me, that's a very, very interesting question. And the third thing I wanted to say is that I think you've absolutely nailed it. Every single party is patriarchal based, and all of them do pay attention to women, do pay lip service to them, but it's only if the males in the party, their interests are not sacrificed. Yeah. So, yep, that's my 5 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you, Marana, for that. I'll answer your second question. I think I agree with your first and second comment. First and second, yes. First and third. Yeah, it's a very interesting. The Indigenous Fijian women that I talked to in NFP also said they're losing a lot of votes as well by joining the NFP, because NFP, does not have that appeal to culture and tradition as SODELPA would have had. But they feel safer. They feel that their voices are actually taken into account. I never managed to talk to any Indo-Fijian women, but I did talk to Indo-Fijian men in SODELPA and PEP, and they feel valued as well. Because what I found in NFP was, and this became a paper that I presented to a certain extent, but what I found in NFP was these older Indo-Fijian men from the 1990s with a sense of, what's the word is evading me, sort of that glory of the past and nostalgia, the sense of nostalgia, and they actually have a lot of background hidden power that they employ. And a lot of the Indo-Fijian men in the other two indigenous parties actually feel very disempowered within this as well. I feel disempowered within NFP as well, because I'm Suva born, Suva raised, don't have the connections to sort of the settlement, Indo-Fijian settlement politics that actually plays out, or connections to cane farming as well, history of that. So there are these sort of subtle ways in which it operates. I know one Indo-Fijian woman I talked to in NFP actually said that she prefers to work with Indigenous Fijian men than Indo-Fijian men. And she was very blunt about it. Can't really write it in my thesis, because if I write it within that context, her identity will get released, and there is then, like you said, Fiji is small and people are easily identifiable. So I can't really write about that, but she did mention this very clearly to me. It's like, Romitesh, I prefer to work with Indigenous Fijian men because they give me the time and space and they listen. When I'm talking to Indo-Fijian men within my party, it's so difficult because I'm always told what to do and expected to perform. So yeah, but we'll talk next week. I'll send you an email.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, Romitesh. My name is Yuva. I'm a master's student from Copenhagen. And so I just wanted to look at, you mentioned briefly the influence of Indo-Fijian businessmen. And I was wondering where the role of money applies within your typology of masculinity? Is it a source of power? How does it manifest in Fijian politics? Was it across all parties? Was it distinct? What's the role of capital in political parties? And then follow-on question from that. When masculinity is projected in Fiji, you presented on that. What does it look like when they present their masculinity abroad? Does it take on the same lens? Is it filtered? Is it distorted by the people they speak with, whether it's regionally or with former colonizers, other powers? Did you consider that, and how does that come across in your research?
All right. In terms of money politics, it's settled. And I think within the Indo-Fijian community, like we are either to a point where we are all homogeneous, we're not. The money politics people are, how do I say this? These are the big businessmen who are not of indentured background. These are the big companies that actually replaced the Australian capitalists in the 1970s and 80s. They came as free migrants to Fiji in the 1920s, as indenture was ending. They set up small businesses, which morphed into big businesses. These are the power players behind the money behind a lot of the political parties, but also coups. And I think William Sutherland talks about it in his writings on Fiji in the 2000 coup, because he says we need to move beyond the ethnic binary into the capitalist, framework within which Fiji politics operates. And these people actually do support, and they hedge their bets against. And I remember in 2018, there were a lot of cases where Ayaz Kiyum was going to businessmen demanding money, political party funding, because in Fiji, businesses cannot fund. It's individual funding, $10,000 limit. So you see the names of the political party funders, you actually know who these companies are, because their wife, mother, father, children, grandchildren, all are listed on the political party funding list, all of them giving $10,000 each. And these are the big Indo-Fijian businesses which have replaced the Australian sort of business hegemonic capitalists. The second one, yes, I look at international, like Bainimarama use the international platform quite a lot. Climate Champion. And it was to disguise a lot of the anti-democratic practices at home as well. So, and I know we've been talking about it with teaching at USP, a lot of the Solomon Island students would write essays on leadership, and they admired Bainimarama for his stance on Australia, just saying, we don't want you. We'll make other friends. We'll create alternative forums. Rambuka is doing that same thing now with the Ocean of Peace. That's why I said, do not get me started on the Ocean of Peace, because it's a facade of sorts. On one hand, he talks about indigenous rights at home. On the other hand, he tells the Kanaks, don't feed the hand that bites you. Tells West Papuans that, we believe in Indonesia's sovereignty. Goes and bends the knee to King Charles, apologizing for the coup he did against his mother and making Fiji a republic. So he plays the game quite a lot, and he wants to be seen as an international statesman and gains legitimacy internationally as well. And he sees himself as a product of that 1980s, 70s, and 80s independence leaders sort of kind of thing as well. Because the newer generation, he's distinguishing himself from the regional leadership sort of thing. And it's, that this older, matured statesman who was the negotiator for the Commonwealth in the ethnic conflicts in Solomons, but also he was the one who was involved in Fiji in 2000 in ousting Ratumara as the president on a boat with Bainimarama. So he has this very tortured, history and very colorful history where he's had his fingers in different pots and he plays the game quite a lot. But he uses that international sort of thing. I mean, he's in India right now talking about all that stuff. I was just watching a video about, proclaiming Ocean of Peace as, the great thing that the Pacific is doing. But on the other hand, he wants to be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. He wants to be part of AUKUS, and there's these contestations that happen.
Margaret.
Thank you so much, especially for what you said about your own embeddedness in body temperament. Was, really very powerful reflections on being an aggressive activist and also research at the same time. I had a comment and then a couple of questions. the comment, I really liked how you stressed that political masculinities were not about individual attributes, but were actually, these much more kind of collective, linked to kind of models of civic versus ethno-nationalism, and obviously, but and there's something very particular, I think, about this constant recycling of these male figures. And so in some ways, it's like, Bainimarama becomes iconic of this, and Rambuka becomes iconic of that. And so the question that I wanted to ask you about was, if you think that there's something distinctive about Fijian political culture that makes it different, say, to Papua New Guinea, which is not to say there haven't been, incredibly important, big figures. But I mean, really, since Sakuna, I mean, it's like there's something about the kind of particular character of that elevation of male leadership, and I think goes beyond Samari, leaning, et cetera, and the kind of recycling over the cycles of parties and ideological formation. So that's my first question. The second really had to do with, I mean, how many times have we seen the rhetoric of inclusion with no action? And in fact, often the patterns of exclusion, and not least by gender policing. And so I was really interested in that comment about sort of how modern dress, can be kind of seen as un-Fijian. And so do you think that there are different, in terms of the policing of Indigenous versus Indo-Fijian women, do you think there's a different, set of characteristics that are important? I mean, would Indo-Fijian women be kind of blamed for wearing, kind of more Western style office dress or whatever? So I think, I mean, obviously gender policing is happening, in all contexts, everywhere. But there was just something, which of course, raises questions about the woman's body as the embodiment of a certain concept, conceptualization of Vanua. The first style of this is kind of embodying that in a way that's perhaps not so policed for men.
Thank you. First question around distinctiveness around Fijian political culture and how it is different or similar to other Pacific. I can't speak about the Pacific much, but I think since the end of like our independence leaders and they've all sort of, passed on, the mantle of leadership is now with the next generation, and the youth are demanding sort of inclusion in this next generation leadership. Can't speak much about Papua New Guinea. I mean, probably talk to Michael and Eileen at home about this, but I really don't know much to actually say. But I think the distinctiveness of Fiji is the fact that the presence of an other ethnic group has created a political culture which is very distinctive. Because, in the 80s, there was that othering about Indo-Fijian political dominance that led to all these debates around, the nature of the Fijian nation state. And what does it mean for indigenous Fijians in the presence of a growing Indo-Fijian population, which might dispossess them of their land rights and of their culture and their tradition. And these are fears that actually exist. The fears of insecurity are very strong. And I think this is what defines our political culture. And both leaders actually played that quite well.
Sorry, just to come back a little bit, I think in some ways there's a contestation around masculinities. I mean, of course, huge kind of, particularly in Papua New Guinea, huge kind of diversity across the country. But somehow the kind of presence of this kind of racial ethnic cleavage, I think, kind of contributes to a different kind of political culture. I don't know, that's just a speculation. Sorry for that.
Oh, no worries. And yeah, Indo-Fijian women, that's interesting. I remember in 2018, there was this Indian woman, and I'll say this Indian woman from India who had married a businessman in Fiji, Riddhi Damodar, and she joined the National Federation Party, and she went to one of their political party AGMs, and she spoke in fluent India Hindi, or whatever, standard Hindi. There was applause, because that's how men and women are expected to perform in terms of politics and the language of politics of language. But if I speak Fiji Hindi, then I don't speak Fiji Hindi much, but there is that performance that women actually supposed to actually do as well. In terms of dressing, yes, it's very, sari and salwar kameez are, the order of like what women wear. But also like Indo-Fijian women are marginalized in a way that is not the same for indigenous Fijian women, because the political organization, social organization of Indo-Fijians is very different, because the British refused any form of social organization. So the first Indo-Fijian woman to be ever elected to Fiji Parliament was in 1999. Until then, there was one Indian woman from India who married an Indo-Fijian, who was the only Indo sort of, but she was always wearing a sari, and speaking like Indira Gandhi and all that. So there's a lot of those kind of performances that, gets policed as well. Indo-Fijian women, I noticed in political party NFP, there were some younger Indo-Fijian women who'd wear jeans and stuff, and you could hear and they'd join the cover sessions when the older Indo-Fijian women would not. Indigenous Fijian women will join the cover session in an NFP meeting, but the Indo-Fijian women will never. But there were these younger Indo-Fijian women who did join, and you could see the discomfort it brought the men, but also the women who did not part of that cover session. So the way these kind of ideas about the ideal Indo-Fijian woman is very interesting to unpack. And okay.
Sorry, Christine Weir, I used to be at USP. I was going to ask you, you talked about the Methodist Church's links with Sedona. What's happened to the Catholic Church, which was seen almost as aligned with Bainimarama, and also the growing new religious movements, how we want to describe them? I mean, you will remember the Ruggers for Jesus. No, they fizzled out, obviously, but the Methodist Church is not some total Christianity in Fiji. So what's happened with the other groups who were often seen as a bit more pro-Bainimarama during his regime while we were there?
So the current archbishop is very different from the former archbishop. So when Italoi Chung,
yeah.
And he's an academic as well. He's written a thesis.
Sorry, so Chung's there now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
So Petro Matada was very much aligned, and he gave that legitimacy to Bainimarama, and the Methodist Church wouldn't.
Doing so too.
Chung did for a little while, but then he distanced himself
He's
quite
distanced
right now. And then there are these evangelical New Age movement churches. There was a political party in the last elections called the All People's Party or something. It was out of one of these small evangelical churches, and that was the church that actually started attacking NFP for having a transgender candidate. The church and the party itself. These are very fringe churches, so they didn't get much votes. I think they got like a few thousand votes only. But there's a lot more, and the power of the Methodist Church has been fizzling out a little bit within this. But I think because of the closeness,
Within the Methodist Church too.
I think Bainimarama's heavy-handed approach to forcing the Methodist Church to sort of give in or tap out a little bit has had a change in sort of the way that church operates.
I'd say there's always been two tendencies within the Methodist Church in Fiji, and power has jumped between the two. Yeah.
So the Methodist Church led the forgiveness ceremony. And the church is there again in all these official sort of ways. So the AGM for People's Alliance Party, the Methodist pastor was there. At the two AGMs, the youth AGM, the women's AGM for Sodelpa, it was the Methodist pastor was there.
Yeah.
So they're still there. It's just the power of the church as an institution, and it's sort of, there was clear sort of links between these in the 1990s and 2000s. It's sort of fizzling out a little bit. And I think, I don't know.
There's been some shifting within the Methodist Church.
Now we're coming towards the, did you want?
No, there's just some questions on.
Oh, sorry, yes. Safari suits.
Oh.
I mean, thank you, Abdul, for that comment. I think there are there is emerging literature about women who actually embody feminine masculinities or feminized masculinities. I wouldn't say that women in Fiji embody masculinity, but they have adopted patriarchal sort of these bargains that they've made, and they actually uphold the patriarchal dominance and systems. And within Sodelpa, it was very visible as well that these chiefly women who had accrued a lot of power, would not question the gender order. And the same for Indo-Fijian women as well. Older Indo-Fijian women would not question the gender power and look with scorn, at younger women who were actually doing a lot of questioning, being too loud, being too disruptive. I have no comments about the safari suits. I'll have to look into it, but definitely the way Rambuka dresses and performs. Masculinity is also about performance, so it appeals to a certain crowd. And
This jogging on the seafront.
yeah, no, I saw videos of him lifting weights, and I'm like, I don't even go to the gym. It makes me feel so.
Just before we finish, can I just ask whether you think that Fiji can maintain its stability if Rambuka is not the leader of the government standing for election next year?
Well, with the absence of Fiji First, I think it's like all systems go. Sodelpa, interestingly, when I was there, had set up a constituency for descendants of Girmites. And they went to Nodo village and set up an Indo-Fijian sort of wing of the party, small group of men mostly. So there is a rush for Indo-Fijian votes because Indo-Fijians voted overwhelmingly for Bainimarama, and you see Mahendra Chaudhry becoming more and more vocal and challenging, not Rambuka, but challenging Bainimarama demand quite a lot. So there is a rush for Indo-Fijian votes because there's a realization that indigenous Fijian votes will, split because there's a lot of indigenous Fijian parties. It's the Indo-Fijian vote that will sort of now determine, who gets elected to power. It will be a very interesting elections, the absence of Bainimarama, I think, and yeah.
Well,
I mean, we have tomorrow, this Friday when the Supreme Court comes, so we don't know whether the elections will happen in 2026 or not.
Yeah. Look, let me just finish by thanking Romitesh very much for a fascinating, really interesting and stimulating seminar. As you can see, he's given a great deal of thought, not only to the argument of this thesis, but to his place in that argument. It's a very nuanced and personalized thesis as well, so which makes it all the more readable. And I'd just like to thank you very much.
Thank you.